hour to an hour and a half for my question.
All right. Well, we'll look at doing a break after your questions then and go from there. All right. Jury's ready, then bring them in. All right, you may all be seated. Hey, Mr. Early, would you like to call your next witness?
I call Dr. Barry Bates.
Should declare and affirm that the testimony about to give in this matter shall be the truth and the truth and nothing but the truth.
I do. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
Could you please state your name and spell it for the reporter, please?
Barry Thomas Bates, B-A-T-E-S.
And Dr. Bates, what do you do for a living?
Right now I do some consulting and I'm an adjunct professor at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I'm also a professor emeritus at the University of Oregon. In those roles, I teach a little bit, but not very much. I've been retired for some time from those positions.
You stated you were a professor emeritus from the University of Oregon. Could you briefly tell the jury about your career at the University of Oregon and what you were a professor of and what your responsibilities were there?
I was at the University of Oregon for 25 years as a professor. I taught in the area of human performance and biomechanics and some statistics. I had a major research program, and in that program we did work for both the academic work and non-academic work. And I had a number of graduate students, and over my career, I mentored and graduated 29 doctoral students.
Can you tell the jury briefly about your formal education and what degrees you had?
I received my undergraduate degree from Princeton University in engineering. I later received a degree in education from East Stroudsburg State College, a master's degree in education. And then I received a PhD, a doctorate, from Indiana University in an area of concentration of human performance with a specialty in biomechanics and motor learning and a minor in statistics.
When you were at the University of Oregon, did you also hold the position of director of the Biomechanics Laboratory?
I was the founder and director of the Biomechanics Laboratory for my for my time period there, yes.
In addition to that, did you also I should ask you, maybe it's easier if I just ask you, what is Human Performance and Wellness Incorporated?
Human Performance and Wellness Incorporated was a company that I had with other people, outside of the university, which was authorized by the university because of our activities. And we did some litigation work early on, and then more later in the period of time. And we did consulting for companies, a lot of early work in the fitness area of shoes and exercise equipment, and did some industrial work.
And was the consulting that you did through Human Performance and Wellness in the field of biomechanics and human performance?
Yes, it was all tied together.
So we've used these terms, biomechanics and human performance, in describing your career and education. Can you tell the jury what biomechanics is?
Well, biomechanics is simply the study of forces acting on the body and within the body. Example would be if you were struck by an object, say I swung a bat and hit you on the head, that would be a force acting on the body, and it would be transmitted to internal components of the body. The other sort of extreme would be when you walk down the street or run down the street, there are forces on your feet. Those would be evaluated from a biomechanics perspective, and they would transmit into your body, into the various joints and muscles and bones, and could result in injury, for example, but not necessarily. So every force that comes in contact with your body is transmitted internally into your body and can be evaluated by different research methodologies.
And does biomechanics, is biomechanics the study of the forces on the body and then how they translate internally?
Yes, it's the study of the forces, the internal translation, and the effect they have predominantly, well, externally and internally. And one common example would be injury.
And what is human performance analysis?
It's the performance characteristics of the body in dealing with predominantly the forces that the body generates in any situation that you encounter. Again, it could be an accident. It could be a workplace situation where you're operating a machine. It could be sporting events. Just any type of performance or situation you encounter, you have to deal with it at the level of the forces that are imposed on you and the situation at hand, the environment you're in.
So, is it a fair distinction to say that where biomechanics looks at the mechanical aspect of the human body, human performance also incorporates behavioral aspects?
Yes. Human performance, well, if we go to human performance, which is the umbrella term, it incorporates biomechanics, human factors, and other human sciences like anatomy, biology, things like that. It's the total picture of the body operating in any situation.
And for how long have you been studying about human factors evaluation, biomechanics, and human performance, and additionally teaching about those as well?
In 1969, I started seriously working in the area.
You have in front of you a copy of Exhibit 261.
Yes.
Do you know what that is?
It's my short resume.
And does that accurately set forth your educational history, your professional experience and background, your areas of expertise?
Yes, in a resume summary form. My academic vita is considerably longer because it gives a lot more detail.
Example, motor vehicle accidents.
Yes, they have. It involves the aspect of injury and litigation or expert witness type work of understanding accidents, but it also, I've been very involved in research, pure research, looking at how the body functions and how it works and how the forces are accepted and transmitted to the body. And then we've done consulting for think I previously stated, in some industrial companies, biggest one of which probably is Nike. But athletic equipment, athletic shoes, and we early on did work in the development of some of the first scanners that were on the market for grocery stores and things. So industrial as well as academic as well as expert witness.
Have you authored books, articles in the field of biomechanics and human performance?
Yes, I think my academic record, and I think I'm either head or associated with about 110 refereed articles that are in published journals,
When you say refereed articles, what does that mean?
reviewed by others in your field.
And critiqued?
Yes, critique.
Your resume states that you have made over 200 presentations at the national and international level. Can you tell the jury what some of those presentations concern?
Most of them concern human performance, biomechanics, how the body works, a lot of them had to do with injury. We spent a lot of time studying injuries of the lower extremity of the leg, the foot, and the knee relative to performance. It was a good model to use in terms of being able to understand how forces acted on the body and some of the injuries that were caused by those forces. Some of them were just in general performance categories also.
There came a time when I retained you to consult with me in this matter. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
There came a time when I retained you to consult with me in this matter. Is
Yes,
that correct?
yes, I think it was probably early in this year.
And in connection with that consultation, were you provided with a number of materials that concerned the event on September 16 of 2016 involving Todd and Barbara Kendhammer?
Yes,
Among those, were you provided with all the reports generated by the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory?
to the best of my knowledge, yes.
Were you provided with photographs that were taken by the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department as well as by the Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory?
I had a considerable number of photographs that I received and reviewed.
Were you provided with the 911 calls made by Todd Kendhammer on September 16th?
Yes,
Were you provided with Barbara Kendhammer's medical records?
most of them. I'm not sure if I had 100% of all of them, but I had many of them, including the autopsy.
Were you provided with the report of autopsy of Dr. McCubbin?
Yes,
Were you provided with a transcript of Dr. McCubbin's testimony at a prior hearing in this case?
yes,
Were you provided with squad videos from the West Salem Police Department and the La Crosse County Sheriff's Department?
Are you referring to the interviews with
Yes, sir.
Todd himself?
Yes,
yes,
Todd.
yes, I had those.
Were you provided with surveillance videos from the West Salem Quick Trip, the Union State Bank, and a place called Wild Winds?
I really don't recall.
Would it refresh your recollection if I showed you a list of materials?
Yes, I received a flash drive with over 100 documents on it, and it's hard to remember specifically each one, to be honest.
Do you recall receiving reports of interview with witnesses to the events?
Yes,
were you able, here we go. All of those materials were sent, were you able to have the time to review all that was sent to you?
Yes, it took considerable amount of time, but yes, I spent a lot of time reviewing all of the materials and categorizing them and deciding whether to keep them in which folder or kind of file to keep them in. It was a long, tedious process, but that would serve as a starting point after I began. I agreed to look at the case.
And as a result of your examination of all the materials with which you were provided, were you able to come to an opinion to a reasonable degree of scientific and technical certainty about what was the cause of the injuries to Barbara Kendhammer on September 16, 2016?
Yes.
And what was that opinion?
My opinion to a reasonable scientific and technical certainty was that the injuries and resulting death were caused by the penetration of the passenger windshield by a pipe which struck the passenger in the vehicle.
Having said that, can you explain to the jury how it is that you came to that conclusion?
Well, how I begin most cases and how I began this case was what I call our term a reverse engineering process. And that process is one in which I typically start with I start with an overview of the case of what people are saying, try to be open-minded about it, but then go typically to the medical records and look at what the major or primary injuries were. And then once I have in my mind established what are the major injuries, major tissue damage, the major injuries from a biomechanical perspective, then I start reviewing materials and putting materials into classified categories to try to eventually come to a conclusion. So in this case, for instance, one category I'd looked at would be the documents that relate and photographs that related to the windshield. As an example. The other, I already indicated the autopsy and the reports associated with the autopsy, the medical records, background history, timelines of events that may have occurred. Anyway, so by putting in categories and then reading through or reviewing the materials and putting those materials in the appropriate categories, it gives a starting point to attempt to understand what happened and how it happened and to come ultimately to a conclusion or an opinion about what happened.
In completing your task, did you have occasion to write a report documenting the facts and data on which you relied, the process by which you approached this, and then your final conclusions and opinions?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 206. Is that your report?
This is a copy of my report, yes.
I move Exhibit 260 into evidence.
Mr. Franke?
I did a supplemental report also eventually.
I understand.
Okay.
No objection, Your Honor.
260 will be received.
In your report, and here I'm looking at page 4, You include a section called time and position analysis. See
Yes,
that?
yes.
Was an analysis of time and position of import to you in reaching the conclusion that Mrs. Kendhammer died from injuries received by a pipe coming through the window of the automobile?
It was one that was considered important in understanding as part of the total opinion.
So can you tell the jury about what it was you observed and why that was important to your opinion?
Your Honor, may we approach?
No? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to send the jury out for a few minutes. There'll be a short break, 5 minutes or so. Don't talk about the case.
Your Honor, the objection I was going to make, and I was going to explain at sidebar, was that we have gone over Mr. Bates' report, and there were certain areas that we'd agreed he would not go into. In this section, there is an opinion at the end that I believe we agreed he would not go into. I thought maybe Mr. Hurley had forgotten, or there was a misunderstanding, and he was going to go into that opinion. It's my understanding this witness will talk about the times involved in the case, but not give an ultimate opinion as to whether or not it would be enough time to execute a murder. With that understanding, I believe I'm okay with that. And also just to let the court know there are some areas within reports that we agreed were not relevant or would not come in. So my objection will only be that if this witness is giving an opinion as to the amount of time it takes to execute a murder, I think that would be irrelevant and beyond his expertise.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to ask that question. What I wanted him to explain was those times that he considered critical to his analysis of the overall picture.
That's fine. And so it's my understanding that there's some objectionable parts of the report that you both have agreed you will not go into.
Right. That's been true with respect to virtually every expert's report in this case.
Well, I don't doubt that, but just for this particular witness, that's the case going forward with him, correct?
Yes.
Correct.
All right, well, I guess if there's any other objections, Mr. Greinke, I guess you can just phrase it sort of as such.
I will.
As irrelevant, I guess, would be a good one from your report without telling the jury what it is, and
Sure.
we won't have to do another sidebar. Since I gave them a few minutes, if anyone else needs a break, we'll be in recess for at least 3 or 4 more minutes. Feel free to do what you need to.
Could cause death. And we have some scraping, some kind of clicking on the back of the skull, like in the region right above the fracture. And so if a pipe did strike there, with or without the flange, it could easily cause that, reasonably cause that kind of skin damage, and at the same time be forceful enough to cause the fracture. The pipe coming through the windshield, the pipe weighed a little over 10 pounds. It had a velocity. It would have to have had a velocity, a minimum velocity of the speed of the moving vehicle. Could have been faster, depending upon where it came from and how it got in, but it had to be at least that fast. So it's coming in at a high rate of speed. It's a heavy pipe, and it certainly has enough force to biomechanically cause the damage to the skull and the back of the head.
Let me stop you there because there are a couple of things I need to correct for the record or show for the record, and then I have some questions about what you said. One is you were demonstrating for the jury with your body.
Yes.
The process of how ducking or attempting to avoid an oncoming object would look if one were in an automobile. And when you did that, I believe from a seated position, you turned your body to the left, you turned your head downward, and you
Turned my body
or to the
to,
right.
to the right, to the right because of the, go ahead.
And you turned your head downward and to the right, even more so than you had turned your body to the right. Is that correct?
I didn't mean to be exactly precise in that movement. What I meant to say was, okay, the reflexive pattern of trying to duck is one. That would be normally to move away from the object. Two, it would be exacerbated by the fact that the seatbelt is across the right shoulder, and the anatomy of the of the neck region, the musculature and so forth, would have a tendency to just turn the head slightly in that direction. And that's where I get the combination of movements to expose the left posterior skull to the pipe.
In a fairly current automobile, the seatbelt moves with the body if one is moving slowly.
Very slowly.
If one is not moving slowly, what happens with the seatbelt?
Seatbelt is designed to lock.
And when it locks, does that cause the body to jerk at all?
Well, it would cause the upper body to be restrained, its movement to be restricted, which would allow this other movement to continue because of the laws of physics and the anatomical structure of the region.
And the other movement that you just demonstrated continuing is the head of the person following the path of the turn, but not necessarily with their shoulder able to follow.
Correct.
The autopsy report reflected 2, possibly 3 lacerations to the back of the skull.
Yes.
How does a pipe, a single pipe coming through the windshield, yield 2 and possibly 3 lacerations?
How it does or could, it could in that when you're striking an object like the skull, or the skull obviously has skin, which is not fixed. So when an object strikes, it's possible for it to kind of skip or jump. That's a reasonable, an example would be you're using a tool like a drill and you're pushing on something and at an angle. And what happens if you're not perpendicular? Sometimes it does this. It skips on you. Well, the same thing could happen here because of the skin and the hair, the looseness. It could skip. And we're talking about very, very, very short times. If you were able to watch it, you wouldn't perceive the movement even it's that quick. So it could skip as part of the process of striking. It could make a skip, or it could. The other possibility that's reasonable is that it was contacted twice, or simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, by the flange and the end of the pipe. The pipe itself could be lower, and the flange on the pipe could be the nicking device. But it's consistent with that kind of a movement and an object striking.
Were you able to come to a conclusion to a reasonable degree of scientific and technical certainty about which end of the pipe had entered the vehicle?
It was my original conclusion that it was the flanged end because of the report that said there was glass embedded in that end of the pipe. I've since heard in some conversations that maybe it wasn't absolute, but for me, looking at it and seeing glass in the flanged end of the pipe was sufficient for me to consider or conclude that it was that end of the pipe that came through first.
You've spoken about the lacerations to the back of the head, but you spoke about 3 major injuries in this case.
Yes.
Can you explain to the jury how the other major injuries in this case lead you to the conclusion that the injuries were incurred as a result of a pipe coming through the windshield?
Okay, if we go through the sequence, the second injury I talked about was the bilateral fracture to the nasal bone. Okay, that's the result of an impact to the frontal face area. And if the head is in this position and is being hit by a pipe and pushed down, a very reasonable and logical possibility would be, or is, that the face either made direct contact with the dash in a fairly symmetrical way, or it could be that the face made contact with the dash with the Bubba cup in between. I couldn't say that, but I think it's a direct case of the head being pushed down into something, either directly into the dash or the dash with something in between the face and the dash, and that position would cause, or could cause, the bilateral fracture to the nasal bone.
And the third major injury was which?
The third injury that I think was one could examine biomechanically in this sequence was the injuries, these separations in the cervical, in the cervical neck bones. Okay, I think one doctor described them as whiplash. Most of you are familiar with the concept of whiplash, where it often occurs in a rear end collision and the body's pushed forward and the head snaps back. Well, obviously, that's not anything like what I've been describing. But if you think about what is involved in that injury, it's a combination of the head being thrust back relative to the body not being thrust back, being thrust forward. So it's a case of head back, trunk either fixed or going forward. So if you now put a force on the back of the head and stop the front of the head like this, and the trunk is still in its original position, that's what's called an extension, a hyperextension type movement injury, and it has the effect of damaging the cervical spine or causing separations. They weren't breaks, but they were separations. They were distinct according to the autopsy, the medical reports I looked at.
And in this
So now, let me just, so you got response, impact, smash, pushback. They all are typically sequential type maneuvers, which can be, or could certainly be, initiated by the pipe, because again, one other factor is that you're saying, well, the pipe came through the windshield, but keep in mind the pipe came through the windshield not in a direction toward the face of a sitting person. It came through the windshield at an angle approximately perpendicular to the windshield, which would put the end of the pipe for a person sitting normally down in their midsection area. So you have to have the body shift to align with, or to get in alignment with the pipe coming through the windshield in its orientation. And I didn't say perpendicular, I said approximately perpendicular. That could be 10 degrees, and we don't know. Except we know it's fairly close to that because of the break pattern in the glass.
Was her particular cervical injury, or let me withdraw that. Did you just speak of essentially two types of whiplash, about which?
I spoke of two ways whiplash can occur. The typical way that most people think about, of the rear end collision and the head being snapped back, which is the more common way, but it's not. It's the mechanism that I was talking about, and that mechanism can be created by a different scenario of pushing the head, physically pushing the head back and restraining the trunk.
And to a reasonable degree of professional and scientific and technical certainty in this matter, is that the cause of the compression of Barbara Kendhammer's neck, her cervical spine instability, and the widening of the C5, 6?
In my opinion, yes. Now, there's a lot of other damage to the neck that's reported in the autopsies relative to other mechanisms, which I am not dealing with or directing my attention to, because there were so many things done to her in the hospital, and that there are other, and the doctors and the people doing autopsies can argue or can discuss those. That's not. I'm just looking at the cervical damage that approximates, the whiplash concept.
Now I want to go back to the time and position analysis. As a result of your review of the documents and data supplied to you in this case, were you able to come up with a timeline of events that preceded this occurrence on September 16th?
Yes, there was some documentation, but I was also concerned about matching that documentation with statements. Like Todd said, they left the house between 7:30 and 7:45. Well, did he remember that correctly, or was that accurate? Well, if we'll go to the dashboard GPS results, they suggest that actually there was an identification at the house position at 7:36. That was an accurate, a reasonably accurate. What they do is they just give a time, and then they give a circle of possible locations. And if you have a small number like 1, that means it's very accurate. If you have a number like 300, it means that's not very good, because this point has very low value because it could be all over the place. So you look at those from the point of view of position, it's going to be time and accuracy. So the 736 was a reasonably accurate, was an accurate identifier. So that was consistent with what was reported in the interview about departing the house. And then the next time position data that was reasonably accurate was when they drove, and this was also part of the transcript, they drove to the neighbor's house that he had been helping to maintain, and that was just a short distance up the road, and the GPS data, see, I look at my notes, I'm sorry, but I can't remember all these things exactly. East Scotch, okay, that, they were up there for a couple minutes, and the one time mark that we had was, the latest one was at 7:49. So if we left the house at 7:37, had a reasonably accurate reading, and got up and stopped for a few minutes at the house and left at 7:49, that seems to be consistent with what was being said. The next reasonable, wanting to find the accidents. The accident site, there was a marking about where the accident site was described on the road, and the time marking there were actually 2, 7:57 and 7:58. So now we have a reasonable amount of time to drive, not race across town, but not take it easy, but to just get to where the accident site was described. At that point, after the descriptions of after the accident, what happened was Todd made a right-hand turn on the coulee and drove about 300 feet down the road. So the next markings should be somewhere out in that vicinity where the vehicle stopped, and the time markings there were 802, well, there were two of them at 802 from the two different phones. So now, again, we're still reasonably consistent with the accident outside about 7:58, turning on the road, driving down there, and at some point in that time frame, 8:02 seems like a reasonable time. And that now also is consistent with another report that identifies a person driving by the vehicle sometime between 8:02 and 8:04 and making some statements about glass, which I don't want to talk about now, but there was another reference to the time 8:02, 8:04 of the car being in the ditch by the side of the road. And then finally, the next, I think around shortly thereafter, 8:05 and 6, I believe, are the times that the 9/11 calls were made. Those are documented independent of, other than that they were made, the timing is documented by a different source. And then there are other things happen when the first responder comes and so forth that aren't really particularly critical.
A witness in this case has testified that on inspection of the vehicle, he found no glass in the passenger door map compartment. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Is the notion that Barbara Kendhammer was incurred her injuries as a result of a pipe coming through the windshield consistent with the observation that there is no glass in that passenger door map compartment?
It certainly could be consistent. It's not an absolute, but I mean, she was by that point either flailing or unconscious, and her body position is still restrained, but she could be in any of a number of positions at that point. But the glass would have come through with her body partly in that direction anyway because of being struck. And if the pictures I recall seeing, there's kind of fine glass spread over a cone type area. And the fact that none of it actually dropped into that compartment, I don't think is, wouldn't cause them necessarily rely on that to come to a conclusion.
If Barbara Kendhammer had ducked and turned her head in the manner you suggested, is there anything about that notion that is inconsistent with the blood spatter analysis that was performed by the State Crime Laboratory?
Not that I'm aware of. At first I was puzzled. Initially I was puzzled, but when I thought about it, it wasn't, of the fact that there was blood a fair amount of blood in the console. But if you think about the fact that what happens when a car takes a right-hand turn, if you're a passenger, what do you tend to do? You don't really go left. You really just keep going straight ahead, but the car turns away from you. So it appears as though you go left. So if you're injured and starting to lose mobility and so forth, the fact that you'd be thrown to the left over the console is perfectly logical from a physics or a biomechanics perspective. So that blood became, that indicates that there was damage to me. There was damage before the turn, or excuse me, an injury before the turn, and that was part of a natural physics reaction relative to the maneuvering of the car.
And if her head were down at the time that the injury was inflicted from the pipe coming through the windshield, is the absence of blood on the back headrest at all remarkable?
Not necessarily. Again, the body's pretty limp at this point. It could be in any of a number of positions. She has a hoodie on. Would she have been thrown? There's no reason to have her thrown back. There's more of a reason to have her front and to the side from a physics point of view. So the fact that she didn't end up sitting, being thrown back and remaining for any period of time with her head on the seat is not indicative to me of any particular thing.
And if she had been leaning forward and to the right at the time of acquiring the injury from the pipe, then at the time the pipe came through the windshield, could glass have gotten onto her back or behind her in the seat?
If she, depends on, certainly if she made her reflexive move as a result of seeing the pipe or object coming, then she would have been forward and down when the pipe came through, which case some of the glass certainly would be expected to go over her back or over top of her.
Is the blood pooling on the floor mat of the front passenger compartment consistent with the notion that after receiving the injury, Barbara Kendhammer's head was down in or around her lap?
I don't think, I think initially it would have been pushed down, then the turn would have moved her to the left, and then she would have come back because of, again, not consciously, but unconsciously because of body structure. She would have a tendency to come back and probably stay limped forward.
You were able to review the report of Dr. McCubbin, is that correct? The
Yes.
pathologist
That's
who
the
performed the
pathologist
autopsy.
who did the autopsy and then did there was another document.
In her report, in a written report, she states in summary, the totality of the pathologic findings are inconsistent with the reported accidental mechanism, parenthesis, with the reported account of a pipe falling off an oncoming vehicle, coming through the passenger side windshield and striking the decedent, end parenthesis. Do you agree with Dr. McCubbin's opinion?
I do not agree with the fact that the injuries could not have been caused by a single event. It's my opinion they were caused by a single event.
And that single event
That
was
was
what?
the pipe coming through the windshield. And I think she was looking at it from a purely medical perspective, not a biomechanical perspective. She wasn't looking to piece them together in a reverse engineering process. She was just looking at it medically, which is a reasonable way for her to look at it.
Are the three major injuries to Barbara Kendhammer which you identified, are these consistent with the notion that those injuries were inflicted outside of the vehicle?
The blow to the face would be not unreasonable outside of the vehicle if two people were facing each other and the one person smashed the other person. That one, I mean, could be independently, I think, staying outside the vehicle. The other two are much more difficult to explain or to figure out how they could happen. I mean, I can come up with some wild theories. You know, he puts her face down and puts her knee in the middle of her back and grabs her head and pulls it up.
In order to create the
neck
injury to the,
neck injury. I don't think that's particularly reasonable, but it is actually, you have to acknowledge it as a possibility. The head injury with the pipe is more difficult because you'd have to have Barbara would have to be lying on the ground face down, and the pipe would have to be thrust in at a very low angle while the person was motionless on the ground, because it has to cause the two sets of injuries. So if you think of a person lying on the ground and you're trying to drive a pipe, it's not a very, it's, if you're really trying to cause damage with a pipe with a person on the ground, you'd go up and smash them straight down. You wouldn't get the kind of injury that you're looking at here. So I don't think so. I don't think it's reasonable.
to a reasonable degree of scientific and technical certainty, were these three major injuries to Barbara Kendhammer inflicted inside the vehicle or outside the vehicle?
My opinion is they were inflicted inside the vehicle by the pipe striking her first in the head and then the sequence occurring. And let me say, I think they were a sequence. I don't think you can identify them independently as being caused inside the vehicle.
So if you could elaborate on that.
Well, I don't, again, if you think about the injuries and take each one separately and say, how could it be inflicted by two people, one person being injured and the other person being the person causing the injury, you have to think about restrictions in space, body position, and so forth. So let's take them one at a time. Again, if you take the head injury, first of all, the pipe's 53 inches long. You don't have any way to move it inside the vehicle unless you turn down the driver's side window, put half of it out the window, and somehow get the passenger to turn her head all the way over to the other side away from the person and lean forward so that the pipe could be brought in back in through the windshield, or the window and into the head. Generating the force in that body, in the body position with the restriction of the interior and the steering wheel and all that is just not, I don't think that's, I don't think that could be done. The binasal fracture, to cause that, you'd have to have the people basically facing each other, which means the passenger would have to be turned almost all the way around toward the driver, being belted in and coming way around here, and the driver somehow twisting in the other way to be able to throw a punch or a cup, hit her with a cup fairly symmetrically in the face. So again, and generate the necessary force. Biomechanically, it's a difficult thing to do. And the third, the neck injury, I think what we have to do is we have to push the head back and pull the trunk forward. Again, if I'm the passenger, how do I get turned all the way around? I can't even do it. Turn all the way around, facing the driver, so that he can reach behind and stabilize the body, and then with his other hand, with the steering wheel here and everything else, push the head back hard enough to cause the injury. I mean, I'm not going to say theoretically it's not absolutely impossible, but it's so low probability, in my opinion, based upon the biomechanics, that I don't think it's a reasonable explanation by any means.
Does the field of human response or human factors include consideration of the limitations of memory?
Yes, memory is a major part of the human factors, body's capabilities and characteristics.
So I want to call on your expertise here to explain to the jury how people remember, and especially the concept of short-term memory. Do you understand what I'm talking about here?
Well, short-term memory, excuse me, is a temporary source of memory before it's put into long-term memory. And long-term memory, then, when one wants to recall, one goes to long-term memory, brings the item up into short-term memory temporarily to describe it or whatever.
Is all short-term memory reposited into long-term memory?
At a conscious or subconscious level, yes. But the short-term memory in itself is very prone to problems.
What kinds of problems?
Okay, short-term memory is an attempt to take what you're looking at and remember it by putting it into long-term memory, if you know, into long-term memory for later recall. Your eye, well, it could be, in this case, we're talking mostly visual, but it could be your sounds. Any of your senses could sense something into short-term memory, and it's in it almost always in an incomplete form, and put it in eventually encode it and put it back into long-term memory. The problem is there's so many things that can influence what you thought you saw, or what you did see within the big picture. There have been a lot of studies done where people are exposed to pictures with detail in them, and then later they're asked to recall things about the pictures. And most people can identify one or two things, a couple things in the picture, but they miss most of it because effectively you fill in the blanks based upon your past experiences and what's already in your memory. So your eye, you got to remember, your eye is limited. If we don't have a good sign there. Well, the clock's not a good one. But if your eye has two basic. There's central vision, which is a very small area, which is what you really see, 2 or 3 degrees. And everything outside of that is peripheral vision, which gets more and more blurred as you go away. So
Did you say 2 or 3 degrees?
degrees
2 or 3 degrees is the extent of one's central vision?
for central vision. And then peripheral vision, it depends on the individual, it goes out wide, but it gets, your ability to identify out here is very limited, further away you go. So anyway, what happens in the research literature is that people look at something, and it's very clearly conducted research that only some of the things are truly recognizable, the rest are. And this is not a bad term, but they're created based upon your individual experiences. A very good example of this, as I've come across many times, is there's a car accident, and somebody says, I heard the bang, and I looked around and saw the accident. Think about that. Do you think that's possible? I heard the bang. Now the accident's already happened. Actually, it happened before that because the bang takes time to get to your ear. And I looked around. But people really believe when they look around, they see the accident happening when actually they saw something happen after the accident. But that's the way memory works. it's almost scary to think about what we remember and how we remember it. So it's, people try to do the best they can, and well, let me one other research perspective is that the difference between attempted recall and and actually lying. It turns out that people who lie are much more consistent in their reporting of an event than people who are trying to actually recall the event. Because when people are lying, they typically create the event in very good, tight form before they put it into long-term memory, where the person that's trying to figure it out is sometimes is all over the place, which I think is a perfect case of this, in this case, where the version that comes back is different each time because of the way memory works. I'm sorry, I got off track.
You talked about encoding short-term memory for long-term storage.
Yes.
Do you recall that? Can the conditions under which short-term memory is created interfere with this encoding process?
Well, they always interfere. They interfere, yes, they always interfere because of things like stress, the speed of the event, how fast it happened, the surroundings, just all sorts of things out there influence your interpretation of the event before you, and what goes into long-term memory.
Is it more difficult to accurately encode an event if one is under considerable stress at the time of perceiving the event?
Stress and time are two critical factors in encoding correctly. And when you encode an event that's only partial in your memory, what happens is your mind says, I can't tolerate these blanks and misses and that, and you try to say, you go back to your past to try to figure out what really happened.
I have no further questions.
Right. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break at this point for about 15 minutes or so. Don't talk about the case. We'll let you know when we're ready to have you come back in. You may all be seated. Right, the record can show we're in the courtroom outside the presence of the jury. Any other issues before we begin with you, Mr. Grinke?
No, Your Honor.
Mr. Hurley?
No, sir.
All right, if the jury's ready, you can bring them in. All right, you may all be seated. This time, Mr. Grinke, you can begin your cross-examination.
Thank you. Dr. Bates, I wanted to just go over briefly with you a few things that you mentioned about your experience, okay?
Yes.
Have you ever been called upon to investigate a crime scene?
A crime scene?
Yes, as an initial investigator?
No, not as initial investigator.
Do you have any experience interviewing suspects of suspected of crimes?
I don't interview myself. I review interviews that have been made.
Just a second, Mr. Grinke. Dr. Bates, can you get the
Oh,
microphone a
I'm
little
sorry.
closer
Yes,
to you
I'm
there?
sorry.
Thank you. I'm having a hard time.
I do not interview people. I rely on other people's skills and then review their work.
You are not a forensic pathologist, correct?
That's correct.
And I believe you said on direct you do not have a medical degree.
I do not have a medical degree.
And if I misheard you, please correct me. I think you said on direct that most of your work has been done in the lower extremity injuries.
I said most of my research, academic research work is in that area. My litigation work is quite varied.
Okay. And when you say your litigation work, you mean testifying in court?
I mean, reviewing cases and sometimes testifying in depositions and so forth, yes.
And is that primarily what you're doing these days, is consulting and testifying as an expert witness?
These days, I'm primarily retired, and I have a few active cases.
Okay. How much do you get paid
How much do I get paid?
for doing this?
Okay, we had an hourly rate of $200 for reviewing and $250 for active work.
Would active work include testifying?
Yes, and we do not change it. Our rate's the same for testifying and active work, other than testifying.
And do you know how much you billed so far in this case?
I think we, under our assumed business name, have billed about $14,000.
A couple of things now, turning to the report that you generated, okay? One of the areas that you wrote about was windshield analysis. It's at page 5 of your report, Exhibit 260. Was it your opinion that there were 2 areas of damage and both had 2 impacts within?
That was my original thought, yes. I've since just don't agree with that. I've had conversations which indicate other possibilities for
Okay.
the double impact of the primary area.
Your report that was dated August 4th of 2017 initially stated that both impact areas further contain 2 impacts within. Is
That's
that-
correct. That's what it said.
You since changed that opinion, I understand?
I've had conversations that said that I said the one in the major impact area, I thought there were 2 impacts, one by the pipe and one of an unknown cause. I've had conversations that indicate that the one that I thought was by an unknown cause had different orientation. Was created differently.
Okay. And the other impact area you still felt had 2 impacts in the center area close together and less discernible.
Yes.
Now, you also, I believe, testified on direct that you thought that the pipe entering the windshield was at approximately perpendicular to the windshield when it entered.
Approximately. I emphasized the word approximately. I said, I think it's added to that plus or minus 10 degrees anyway, at least.
That'd be approximately within 10 degrees of perpendicular. If a person were standing next to the vehicle near the passenger door and hitting the pipe into the windshield, that would make it about perpendicular, wouldn't it?
The door is closed and they're standing by the vehicle.
Yes.
They're gonna, like in the police demonstrations.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be approximately perpendicular.
The injuries now I want to turn to that you have been talking about, I believe you consider 3 of those injuries to be major injuries. Is that accurate?
I think I said major from a biomechanical perspective.
Okay. From your perspective, the
Yeah,
3
from
are...
my evaluation of the incident, yes.
That ignores the other injuries, and she had a total of about 50 injuries. So you don't include the others in your analysis.
What I called relatively minor injuries, yes, correct.
Okay. You indicated in your report that the injury to her face, specifically the bilateral nasal fracture, could have come from the defendant smashing her face into the dash.
I said that was a possibility.
That's
yes.
one possibility. You also believe that it's possible that someone could punch someone in the face, correct? And cause that damage.
Independent of the environment? Well, yes, I'll answer that, yes.
Okay. If somebody's sitting in the front seat, driver's seat, and they're turned towards a person in the passenger seat and swinging at them with a left fist, that person is likewise facing the driver in an argument. That would be relatively easy to hit somebody square in the nose, isn't it?
Not relatively easy, but reasonable. Both people have to be facing each other. The left
Okay.
punch has to be thrown around the steering wheel, or within the environment of the steering wheel and the space.
Okay, assuming the steering wheel wouldn't be in the way, that would be consistent.
Well, I disagree with that in the sense that the steering wheel cannot not be in the way and get a long enough thrust to get a forceful punch. Because if you move to the right of the steering wheel to do this, you have to lean over, and now you're relatively close to the person. So I think it's possible, but I don't think it's all that probable.
To hit somebody with a left and not have the steering wheel in the way, you don't think that's possible? You think steering wheel would be in the way?
I know, I just said it would, if as long as the person leaned to the right,
Okay.
then, and got past the steering wheel. The other restraint then is the fact that the distance and the force that can be generated, but it's possible.
Is it your position that the force would not be a lot of force because there's a reach there? A distance between them?
That would be certainly a limiting factor, yes.
Okay. Similarly, if you were to reach forward in a vehicle to up where the rear view mirror is and punch a windshield, there's quite a lot of reach involved there, isn't there?
With the left hand, yes, you have to reach over the top of the steering wheel and
And over your body,
across your body,
across your body.
yes.
If I use the wrong word, please correct me.
No, it's okay.
Okay. Now, you also indicated in your report that some of the injuries to the neck, a strangulation was a possibility. Is that accurate?
That's what other people said. I didn't think it was a real good possibility, but I didn't think I said, I think I identified strangulation as something that had been documented. A possible strangulation had been documented in the records.
Okay. Page 11 of the report, do you still have it up there? Exhibit 260.
Yeah, well, there a second, this is the hearing. Okay, where are you on page 11?
The last full paragraph,
Dr. McCubbin described?
yes.
Okay.
About 3/4 of the way down in the middle, there's a sentence that says attempted strangulation is a possibility.
Yes.
It says then to apply anterior posterior forces to her neck as implied, B. Kendhammer would have had to be facing T. Kendhammer, which would be reasonable if in fact they were fighting / struggling at this time.
Yes.
Is that accurate?
Yes.
You said reaching across the center console to accomplish this would have been difficult but possible. Did I read that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. So you did write that attempted strangulation is a possibility, difficult but possible.
Difficult but possible.
Now, if I could have the computer on, can you show me picture 69? Exhibit 69. I apologize. Dr. Bates, you've seen this photograph before, I assume?
Yes.
And in this photograph, obviously the head is, the top of the head would be facing towards you,
It's to the left.
to the left in this photograph.
Yes.
At the bottom is one laceration, and you recognized above that on the right side of Barbara's head were 2 lacerations. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Now, can you describe for me, using this photograph if you could, how a pipe could strike her left side first and then skip to then cause 2 lacerations on the right?
I'm sorry, I don't follow your question.
Well, I believe that's your opinion, isn't it, that the back of her head was caused by the pipe hitting and skipping?
I said, hitting the top laceration and the next laceration and then the bone. The occipital bone is to the right and down.
Is it your position that the wound on the left of her skull was caused first, or the wound on her right was caused first?
You're talking right and left,
Okay.
up and down, on the picture you're
sorry.
talking up and down.
I'll fix that. On this photograph, is it your position that the injury on the top or on the bottom was first?
The upper one I think was caused first and the lower one second.
Okay.
Because it proceeds toward the fracture where the primary impact, where the impact caused the bone trauma fracture to the occipital bone.
Okay. So your position would be that while she was seated in her passenger seat, she turned her head and body enough so that the right side of her head was impacted first and then the left?
First of all, I don't think that's the right side. I think that's pretty much center line. If you look at her neck, at about where the 8 is,
Yep.
that's about the center, so 8-1 is about the center of her neck and her head.
Okay.
So that's not the right side, that's more or less the center of her scalp,
Okay.
above the wound that's below it, which is now to the below and to her left,
Okay.
and the bone damage is below, in around the second wound,
Okay.
on the, which would be the lower right of this photograph, but
Sure.
the lower left of her head.
And now Dr. McCubben's testimony was that there are 2 lacerations there on the upper part and 1 laceration on the lower part. It's your testimony that the pipe hit that first part, skipped a little bit, and then skipped a little bit more.
My testimony is that's a probable cause, that's probable cause, that it is reasonable to assume that that it could hit and skip. Or I said the other alternative was that it could be the flange and the end of the pipe.
Still hitting the head twice.
No, it could hit simultaneously then, almost simultaneously, because the flange is up the pipe a ways. But it would still be a little bit of a skip, yes.
And the end of the pipe would cause lacerations going in one diagonal, and the flange would be going in another diagonal?
That would be very reasonable to me, biomechanically.
It would.
Flange has a horizontal edge relative to the end of the pipe, which is round,
Sure.
and what's the distance? Distance between the two is less than an inch.
I'm just presenting to you, what I believe it's Exhibit 7, as a chart, which is actually a page from the autopsy report. Do you recognize that?
I've seen, yes, it's in the report. That doesn't look at all like the photograph, by the way.
Well, sure, it's a drawing, not a photograph.
Well, it's not only is it drawn, it's not accurate compared to the photograph.
Excuse me, Your Honor, they can't see because of the glare.
The light,
Turn
thank you.
some lights down.
Better? Okay,
Uh,
thank you.
In the upper right, Dr. McCubbin testified to those injuries and indicated that was the location of the injuries.
Well, then, I don't know where the injuries from, okay, I'm not gonna argue. The photograph was different. That's all I can say.
It's still your position that the back of the head would have been facing the windshield when the pipe came through the windshield?
Would have been oriented toward more toward the roof than, in other words, bent forward toward the windshield and dash.
Turn the light back on. That's the only time I'm using that. The pipe would have a considerable amount of force had it come off of a vehicle traveling about 50 miles an hour, wouldn't it?
Yes, if it came off a vehicle traveling at that speed, it would be the combined speed of the two vehicles approximately. Unless it hit the ground in between, then it could be slowed down.
Okay. In this case, you, of course, read the reports and the interviews, I believe. You read the
Yes.
reports. And there was no information about a pipe bouncing. Do you remember that?
That's correct.
The speeds at that highway are 55 miles an hour. Would it be reasonable that people might be driving 50 through there?
I think that's reasonable, yes.
If a pipe were to come off of a truck facing another vehicle, you combine the speed, so the velocity is 100 miles per hour? Is that,
If it came off and was able to impact, if everything was consistent, yes, then the speed would be that, the
Okay.
impact speed.
now, you know what foot-pounds of force is?
I know what it is, but I didn't calculate it. It's obviously a 10-pound pipe traveling at 100 miles an hour, slowed down a little bit by the windshield, would cause massive damage.
Massive. It's a lot of foot-pounds of force,
Yes.
right? Do you have any, I'm not going to calculate it 'cause I'm not good at math. Do you have any idea how many foot-pounds of force that might be?
No, not without sitting down and calculating it. Didn't even think about it that way. I just thought about it as being a lot more force than we see here in this trauma.
Sure. You did calculate foot-pounds at some point in your report, but you're familiar with the calculation, right?
The amount of force, the weight of the object times the distance it travels. Yeah.
Okay. 10-pound object, 100 miles an hour, would be similar to bullets fired from guns, right?
Probably some. I'm not a gun person, but
Foot-pounds.
yes, but it would be. It's a lot of force. I'm not.
It's a lot of
I don't think it's a point worth getting into detail on.
Well, if part of your job was to analyze how the injury would be caused, I would think you'd want to know how many foot-pounds of force a pipe would generate if the story was it came off of a truck and came through a windshield.
Well, first of all, I don't believe it came off of a truck and came through the windshield.
Well, I don't either, but
So-
that's the story you were given.
It just was not of concern to me. To me, the concerns were the mechanism and the injuries as they were stated. And it's true that the minimum speed would be of impacting the windshield would be the speed of one vehicle if it bounced off the road.
Still a lot of foot-pounds of force. If it started going 50.
Yeah.
And you said more than what we see here.
I don't know.
Don't know, okay. If your opinion was that something happened in this accident, why wouldn't that be part of your function? You know what foot-pounds are, you know how to calculate it. Why wouldn't that be where you would start?
It's not the way I approach a problem. I approach it mechanistically, and that's the way I approach this.
Okay.
Calculating the actual force, I seldom calculate the actual force in an accident that I consult on.
Well, if you did and the force was inconsistent with it coming through windshield, you would then evaluate the story and try to figure out what else might have happened, right?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. In your report, and I think you testified that it would be pretty difficult to have this pipe inside the car used as a weapon to do any damage to the victim. Is that?
Well, doing the kind of damage, not doing damage. I mean, you could do damage with the pipe.
It'd be difficult.
Just moving it a couple inches,
Sure.
But it wouldn't be major damage.
Sure. Did you evaluate the crime scene and see the blood on the rear passenger tire?
I did not look at the bloods at the scene, but there was either a photograph or mention of a few drops of blood on the rear tire,
Okay.
on the rear of the car.
Could I have the screen up again? Can you go to picture 32?
I've seen that photo, yes.
You've seen this photograph. Okay, it's exhibit number 32 for the record. You see some blood on the grass, and
Yes.
what appears to be some transfer activity on the tire. Is that accurate?
Yes,
Okay. This is exhibit 33. Do you also see some blood on the grass in that
Yes.
area?
yes.
Exhibit 34 is, again, at the scene, some blood spatter on the rim of the tire.
Correct.
The injuries that we see, lacerations of the back of the head, would be consistent with somebody bashing a head against the rim of a tire, would it not?
Could be, yes.
Okay. The, could I have exhibit 64, please? This is a photograph of a bruise to the chin of Barbara Kendhammer. Have you seen that photograph?
Yes.
That also would be consistent with someone punching a person with the left hand hitting the right side of their face, would it not?
Could be, yes.
Exhibit 70, please. This is exhibit 70. You observe the scratches on her neck.
Yes.
Do you agree that those would be consistent with a attempted strangulation with a person scratching their neck to get hands off their neck?
It's a possibility, yes.
And 81, exhibit, please. I'm showing exhibit 81. These are scratches to Mr. Kendhammer's neck, to his left side. Did you see those?
Yes.
Would that be consistent with a struggle, two people facing each other in a car and fighting?
Could be.
Okay. You talked a little bit about the whiplash injury, and there was no mechanism to force her backwards in the passenger seat. Did I understand that right?
No, that's not what I said. I said
I'm
there was
sorry.
no mechanism to force her forward in the passenger seat to cause her neck to go back into a traditional whiplash.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Whiplash injury.
I'm sorry, you're right. I believe I was thinking that we were talking about the blood on the headrest, and I think you said there was no reason for her to be going backwards.
I said there wasn't necessarily a reason for her to go back after she was unconscious. It'd be more likely that she slumped forward.
Sure. You saw the crime scene photos where the car backed into a ditch and went down?
Yes.
That would tend to throw people backwards against the back of the seat, would it not?
Actually, as it went down, it would, if she was unconscious, it would actually allow her to stay forward. And then when it, depending how hard it stopped, she could go back or she could stay forward. It would depend on the precise mechanics of the movement of the vehicle.
Fair enough. It's possible that if the drop were severe enough or fast enough, inertia would carry her backwards.
It's possible, yes.
Okay. And I think your position is that she would have been bending at the waist forward when the pipe would have struck her, and that may have forced her face into the dash.
I said, yes, I said it, that was consistent, would be consistent with a blow to the back of the head with a pipe to force the head in the opposite direction that the pipe was striking, and that would be into the dash or the bubble cup end dash or something of that sort.
The seatbelt would lock if somebody moved quickly forward,
It
would it not?
would lock over the right shoulder, yes.
Okay. And that would prevent her from going further forward to the dash, would it not?
It would prevent her, if she was struck in the back forcefully and restrained only on the right shoulder, I think the force could be sufficient to push her forward, her head forward.
Do you feel that her, in a seated position, bending at the waist, she'd be tall enough that her face would actually reach the dash with her nose?
I don't know that, but there is a possibility of, since there was the bubble cup, that it could be a combination of reducing the distance and causing the same kind of impact. But I don't know that.
And then there would be the dash, then the cup, then her face, and the pipe coming in the windshield. I still don't understand how that forces her head forward towards the dash.
Well, if I have my head here and I strike and I push here, I think my head seems to go forward.
Well, your force is from the back, though. This pipe would be coming from the front.
It's from the back and it's the back and the top.
Okay.
The back is here.
Yep.
It didn't hit her initially there. It had to come in from an angle, and the force would be a combination of this and then this. I'm sorry, that's not word. It down
Down and forward.
forward.
And in order to duck like that, she would have to perceive the object coming at her and relatively quickly beat it to bend forward to get her head down.
She would have to. A typical reaction of a person seeing an object coming forward would be to reflexively, not a reflex, but reflexively move quickly in less than 1/10 of a second.
Okay. And some people might put their hands up.
They might, it's probably if she had something in her one hand, it might not, but it's,
Sure.
yes, another common response would be to raise a hand.
Do you know what tonic immobility is?
I'm sorry, what?
Tonic immobility?
That's just well, I would call it probably static immobility. In other words, it's just just
Freezing?
the resistance that's inherent in this structure. I think that's my understanding.
That's fine, if it's not in your area of expertise, that's fine. You didn't mention, I don't think, in the injuries, a cricoid fracture. Do you remember reading about the cricoid fracture in the autopsy
I
report?
remember reading about a lot of fractures in the neck-throat region, and I basically did not deal with them.
Don't you think it's important to deal with them?
My position was that those were more medically oriented, and I am not a medical doctor,
Okay.
and therefore I felt it was the doctor's responsibility to deal with those. The one I felt I was qualified to deal with was the cervical,
Okay.
and that not because it's of the medical, but because of the biomechanical.
That's all I have then.
You were asked on cross-examination about a number of other cases on which you had worked. How does this one compare in complexity to the other cases on which you've worked?
Well, I did my first case in 1981, and I've done a fair number since that, and this is probably the most complex case I've ever worked on.
And what,
And it's just, the volumes of data were just overwhelming. It's over 1,000 pages of information.
can you move that mic a little closer?
Oh, I said it was one of the most complex, probably the most complex case I've ever worked on, and there were just volumes of data and information.
You were asked about an early opinion that you had reached regarding the shatter patterns to the windshield. Do you recall that question?
Yes.
After having reviewed the shatter patterns in photographs and reports, etc., did you subsequently have the occasion to review the report of Mark Mechelem?
Yes. I know, yeah. Yes.
And did you even speak with Mr. Mechelem today?
Yes.
And did his report affect your perception of those fracture patterns in the windshield?
It gave me since I'm not a glass expert, and I was looking at the original photographs from a purely mechanical perspective, his explanation of how a second fracture could occur made perfect sense and was reasonable and realistic with the potential movements of removing the pipe.
You were asked a question by Mr. Gernke on cross-examination about whether one who was standing next to the door of the automobile and used their hand to thrust a pipe into the windshield could do so in a manner that was approximately perpendicular to the windshield. Do you recall being asked that question?
Yes, some very version of it at least.
Do you recall saying that it was possible?
Possible, but given the fact that the car was in a ditch and all the orientations and the size of and the positioning, it became much more difficult,
Yeah, when he
if
said,
not improbable. But
when you were asked the question, and Mr. Gernke said standing next to the automobile, I don't believe that there was any indication about whether the automobile was flat on the ground or was on an incline. So let me ask you, if an automobile was on an incline, such as was the Kendhammer's Camry on September 16 of 2016, does that increase the degree of difficulty for thrusting a pipe into the windshield by hand so that it enters approximately perpendicular?
and in the location that it entered, yes.
And why does it increase the degree of difficulty?
The reach to get the pipe into position, the amount of thrust that you can create with the pipe, given the reach and the distance you can move it, and just the whole body position is awkward.
Where would one have to stand in order to do it? Would one be standing on the pavement, or would one be standing on the berm?
I'm sorry, on the which did you say?
May I have the almost, please? I'm going to put up on the screen Exhibit 112.
Zoom out, I think.
Where approximately would one have to stand in order to thrust a pipe into the windshield from outside in order to create the marks or the fracture patterns that we subsequently saw on the vehicle?
Well, certainly forward of the door, the front edge of the door. And I'm not convinced, it'd be very difficult in this environment to be able to reach with the pipe in a near perpendicular position and get force enough to drive it through the windshield from the side of the car. I mean, when the police videos that showed it being,
I'm going to object, Your Honor.
oh,
Sustained.
they're not.
Let me ask a question. You're not denying that it is possible, is that correct?
I'm not saying it's impossible, no.
Is it, to a scientific and technical certainty, probable?
I don't believe so.
You were asked many questions about that which might have been possible as having occurred between Barbara Kendhammer and Todd Kendhammer. To a reasonable degree of scientific and technical certainty, what is it that probably occurred to cause Barbara Kendhammer's injury?
The pipe being thrust through the windshield from an unknown source and striking her the way I described, creating the sequence of injuries, biomechanical injuries that I talked about.
You said on cross-examination that you didn't believe that the pipe rolled off of an oncoming vehicle. Do you recall saying that?
Yes,
Did I quote you correctly?
that's correct.
Will you tell the jury why you don't believe that?
Can I refer to my supplemental report? In my supplemental report, there was I looked at some data that was presented, which gave the position, the hypothetical, well, didn't present it as hypothetical. It said that the reason this couldn't happen is because if the pipe rolled off the truck, it would only have a 0.35 second time to fall and strike the windshield. If you look at that more closely and say, okay, where did it strike the vehicle in the horizontal direction? And there was no reference made to this calculation, but the pipe would have had to come off the truck going 20 miles an hour horizontally, parallel to the road. Had to get forced somehow to go 20 miles an hour across the road to strike the windshield in 0.35 seconds. And I don't think that's There's no basis for that at all in any of the data that I've reviewed.
Can a pipe be kicked up by an oncoming vehicle or a passing vehicle?
Yes, certainly it can be.
Have you ever experienced such a thing?
Fortunately and unfortunately. Unfortunately, yes, I experienced it. I was driving down the highway.
I don't object to other stories.
It's not a,
Sustained.
If a pipe is kicked up by an oncoming vehicle, can it be raised to sufficient height to be able to strike a vehicle traveling in the other lane?
if the right conditions are met, yes. If it has the appropriate speed, angle of orientation, and the proper surface characteristics.
To a reasonable degree of technical and scientific certainty in this matter, do you believe, or is it your opinion, that that is what occurred in this matter?
That the pipe came up off the road from some source that we don't know, or I don't know. You think it's more probable than not that that's how it got to the point where it entered the windshield.
And when it's kicked up off the road, does it achieve some altitude?
I don't object to this. This is not an opinion that was revealed before trial.
I didn't go into it. He
It's
opened
also
it.
leading, sustained.
You recall Mr. Grunke asking you whether Mrs. Kendhammer, in order to abduct, would have had to have perceived the object approaching and then beat it.
Yes?
She didn't, did she beat it?
Well, she had enough time to reflexively move her body and head.
But not far enough.
No.
I have no other questions.
Thank you.
You pulled exhibit 19. Oh, it is. That's the pipe. What number is it? 54? Yep. Yes, right. The computer? Dr. Bates, I'm showing you exhibit 19.
Yes.
That photograph is a photograph without the people in front of the car, as Mr. Hurley showed you. You can see on the road along the edge, there's a bag or black something along the grass along the edge. Do you see
To
that?
the left?
Yes.
Yes, yes.
The road doesn't drop off at the edge of the road. There's a couple of feet there at least of tiny shoulder. Is that accurate? The bag is on the
There's a slight grade from the front tire to the middle of the door and before it goes down a little more.
Okay. And so if a person were to stand right where the door would open, the passenger door, they'd easily be within reach of that windshield, correct?
They're within reach of the windshield, yes.
Just like the fireman on the other side would be from the driver's side, a person would easily be able to reach over the windshield in that position. Right?
Easily, they could certainly do it.
This pipe, exhibit number 54, Dr. Bates.
Yes.
If one were to stand next to that car, smash it through the windshield,
Not the way you just did. You'd have to be much higher.
it would be perpendicular to the windshield, correct?
I think your physical example here is much lower than reality.
Average sized male would be standing above the height of the door, correct? That's where the firemen are?
The door would come above his waist a little bit, I would think.
Above his waist a little bit?
Yeah. Well, not the door where it is there, but if the car was on flat ground.
Well, the hood would be waist or below, right?
Okay, about waist. Yeah, about waist. Waist maybe a little above,
If a
but in
person
that
were to-
general vicinity.
If a person were to wash that car, they could easily wash the top of the car without a ladder, right?
I don't really know.
The windshield for sure, right?
Could reach most of the windshield probably.
Right. So
If you twist and.
the pipe were picked up above my waist, almost to my head, that's above the windshield, right?
That is, yes. Now it is, but before you had it much lower, but that's okay.
A person could do it, right? That's my point.
They could get the pipe in a position that's approximately consistent with the impact. Whether they could generate the force is another issue, I don't know.
To put a pipe through a windshield? You know they can, right?
To put a pipe through a windshield?
Dr. Bates, you know they can.
Well, I can't refer to the images I'm thinking of viewing.
Men have put rocks through windows, phones through windows.
And I've seen people try to penetrate a windshield and not succeed the first try.
Like in this case. Thank you.
Objection.
No other questions?
Charlie, anything else? Anything else?
No, sir.
At this time, does any juror have a question for Dr. Bates? See a couple hands, okay. I didn't count yet, but we start with, back to two. What you got?
Yes.
think 5 questions here. Dr. Bates, if you can answer them. The one marked 522 for its exhibit number is, could the injuries to the back of her head be caused by the side of the pipe being swung like a bat? If you can answer that.
It's possible that if one had adequate space to swing the pipe, and remember it's 53 inches long, inside the vehicle, and have her head in a position relatively forward and oriented the right way, that you could strike the head with the pipe. I'm not sure you could generate enough force to cause the injuries, but you could certainly strike the pipe and cause surface damage. I don't think you can get enough force to cause the skull fracture.
Okay. The question marked 523 is, what is your expertise or training in memory?
Only through reading and studying research literature that's been done recently on memory and the brain.
Okay. Question marked 524 is as follows. If it's possible to generate enough force with a fist to fracture the windshield, wouldn't a pipe in a standing position be able to generate more force?
I'm sorry, read it again.
If it's possible to generate enough force with a fist to fracture the windshield, wouldn't a pipe in a standing position be able to generate more force?
If you mean at the windshield, I'm assuming that's what it means.
I assume.
Yes. Yes, I believe you could generate the force if you could get into the proper position.
Right. The one marked 525 is, could a blow to the face or a punch cause the head to whip back and cause the injury to the neck?
It's a possibility if the body were restrained. I think it would be a possibility.
And the last one, 526. From a biomechanical perspective, when Todd reached over the steering wheel, had hit the windshield with his fist, with that kind of force, would he not have more than just scratches on his knuckles? If you can answer that.
It would depend on the orientation of his hand. I would think if he would reach across and strike, he would be striking mostly with, just because of the way the body's put together, striking more with this section and maybe and I don't think he would break anything hitting that hard on the windshield. The knuckle scratching could be scraping on the, for instance, could be scraping on the rearview mirror. And if the fist was thrown like this.
Okay. Right. All right, Dr. Bates, you may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take another recess at this point. Don't talk about the case. We'll let you know where we're heading today. It's getting kind of late. So you may step out. This will be at least 10 minutes. You all be seated. Record can show we're outside the presence of the jury. So, how do you want to proceed? It's getting kind of late today.
It's up to you, Judge.
I don't like putting witnesses on and having them come back the next day to finish even direct or cross.
In that case, we'd have to come back tomorrow, because I only have Mr. Kendhammer to put on today, and it's clear, I think, that we couldn't finish with him today.
Well, we could. Anything's possible, right? Be late, though. All right, we'll
It's
adjourn for today
entirely
then. I don't think there's any other housekeeping we need to do today, is that right?
Your Honor, I would just ask to admit exhibits 147 and 148.
Yeah, let me find those. Which were those?
I used those with Mr. Mashul in my cross. The darkened lights.
Oh, okay. No objection.
What is your highest number marked, Mr. Grinke?
148, that is our highest number. No, we got it.
Right, those both will then be received based on no objection. I noted you had 262 marked. Were you not using that one?
I did not offer it, Your Honor.
That's fine. Okay, anything else from the defense for today?
No, sir.
All right, tomorrow's another day. I think we can get started at about 8:30, so if you can be here, ready to go about 8:30. We'll get the jurors up here real close to that. Again, you can step down, Dr. Bates. I will have the jury come in. I'll tell them not to view the case overnight. So anything before I bring them in and then discharge them for tonight.
No.
Okay. If they can, have them come back in. It'll be very short. All right, everybody may be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, given the hour, we're going to adjourn for the evening. I'll ask that you be back here tomorrow so we can start by 8:30. I'll have counsel ready to go by then. When you leave tonight, don't talk about the case with anybody. Don't think about the case if you can. Try not to think about it. Don't look at any news accounts in any way, shape, or form about it to get anything that you shouldn't be receiving about the case. And we'll see you back here tomorrow morning. You can leave your notes in there. We'll get those secured overnight. And have a good evening. Right, if there's nothing else, we'll be in recess.